Hi class, as promised, I am going to give you an overview of your research essay assignment, and I recommend that before you watch this lecture that you actually print out the research essay assignment, which you can find on your Blackboard under course documents, just so you can have it in front of you, and then some of the things that I'm going over will make more sense, I think. So if you have the assignment in front of you and you're ready to continue, here's the first thing you want to notice is the due date. So your research essay assignment is due November 14th, and just like your first essay, you have to submit it both on Blackboard and in class for reasons we already discussed, right? Between now and the 14th, however, before you actually start working on your essay, you will have two other due dates, right? So one will have to do with your research proposal, and the other one has to do with the evaluation of sources that you will be using. So they are kind of due about, I think one is due 2 weeks from now, and then the other is due 2 weeks after that. So you'll have 2 weeks to complete each one. That's a much, I think, simpler assignment, and you can see it as well under course documents. It says research evaluation, and both of the short assignments are on the same sheet with the instructions and two different due dates. So you want to make sure that you're following that, okay? So just briefly before I go back to the research essay, for your research proposal, you'll just have to essentially tell me, and I'm going to pull it up here just so I know what it is that I don't want to tell you anything wrong and confuse you even further. But for your research proposal, you will essentially have to give me like a tentative title for your research, and brief explanation what you're planning to do, including a thesis statement. So this should not take you more than a paragraph or so. For your source evaluation, so this is due on the 24th. For your source evaluation, which is due on the 29th, you'll have to basically give me a list of your sources. You'll have to cite them in MLA. You'll have to find a way to summarize them. And this will be a little bit longer. But the point of this assignment is really to not only get you to work on your research paper, earlier, and hopefully that will make your research paper stronger, but also I want to be able to see if there are anything that I can correct or give you feedback on before it's too late, because sometimes when you submit the research paper, it's done, and unless you come and see me individually, which is not always the case, or it's not always something that you can do, you're really kind of in a hot water. So we're trying to avoid that, right? So there's the one on the 24th, the one on the 29th. So one has to do with the research essay proposal and the source evaluation. Okay, so those are the two due dates in between now and November 14 when your research paper is due. And this way I can actually look at your thesis and say, yeah, this is something that you want to spend more time on, or no, you really need to revise it now before it's too late. So the due date for your research essays on November 14th, and I'm sorry, I feel like I've been saying the 24th, but it's the 14th. And what are some minimum requirements? Obviously, you want to have an interesting, attention-grabbing title. You want it to be anywhere between 6 and 8 pages in length, and you really want to keep it to 6 to 8 pages in length. Double-spaced, written in Times New Roman 12-size font. Obviously, it has to be an MLA in 8th edition. I kind of maybe wrongly have an expectation that you know MLA, because this is typically something we cover in English 101. So I assume that you're at least familiar with the term, or at least know where to look. And that's essentially the only thing you need to know, right? So if you know what MLA is, it stands for Modern Language Association. It's just a formula that we use for citing sources in humanities. It basically has two components: in-text citations and works cited page. In-text citations, which is exactly what you did for your first essay, right? So we use parentheses, and in parentheses after quote or a paraphrase, we use the last name of the author and a page number, or sometimes a title, or sometimes just the page number, depending on how the quote is introduced and the amount of information given. Works cited page is the organizing of all of your sources alphabetically. So you need to have those two components in MLA. It's not something you have to memorize, but it is something that you have to give a lot of attention to, especially for your research paper, because it's going to be worth 25% of your overall research paper grade. Research paper is essentially just integrating sources together. It's coming up, it's looking at all these different things and figure out what they have to say about a particular topic, coming up with something new to say about the topic, to add to the conversation. But at the same time, it's kind of honing in on the skills of integrating the sources in your essay. And that's why 25% is such a, it's a big number for an essay, but MLA is a huge component of that. And as I mentioned, you don't really have to memorize anything. You just have to know where to go. So where do you go? You can go to mbcc.edu and then click on the library link, which will take you to citing sources. You click on citing sources, just pick MLA, and you will see examples of what your sources should be like. You'll get examples of what in-text citations look like. You will get an Ask a Librarian button if you have a question. If you're working on your essay late at night and you can't reach me or you can't go to the Learning Commons, you can ask a librarian 24/7 and they'll be able to give you an answer. And speaking of that, you can always go to the library for help with your research. You can always go to the Learning Commons, and certainly I'm always available, okay? So if you have a question about MLA or citing sources, please, please, please see me. This is a huge, huge part of your grade. It's really not anything that you kind of, like I said, have to memorize or worry about. You just have to know where to look. And you want to look under mbcc.edu/library/citing sources. That's where everything pretty much is. So that's one thing. The second thing with MLA is that you need to know exactly the kind of source you have. So whether you are using a chapter from a book or an article or an essay or a story from an anthology or a website, depending on the kind of source that you have will impact the way that that citation will look on the works cited page. So you need to know what you have in your hand and you need to know where to look. For this research essay, I'm asking that you use you can use up to 6 sources. There is no minimum per se. I mean, you have to have some sources. It is a research essay, but you can't use more than 6. At least 4 of those have to be scholarly. What does that mean? If you recall maybe your class in English 101, scholarly or peer-reviewed sources are sources which are found in publications written, edited, and organized by people working in a certain discipline. Okay, so this all sounds very vague, but to give you a more concrete example, if you were writing an essay about, say, Melville's Bartleby, and you wanted to publish it in American Journal of Literature, or Journal of American Literature, when you submit that, there is a committee of people who are writers, teachers, scholars, researchers, PhD candidates, and they essentially review your article for accuracy, for content, for style, for contributing to some kind of, ongoing conversation, and then they say yay or nay in terms of publication. If there are issues, they send it back, ask you to fix it. So it's not really like you write an English paper, but it's evaluated by a bunch of math teachers. It's usually by people working very closely in a certain discipline. And they're scholarly because scholars typically do not have they do not have a bias. It's like scientists, they really don't have necessarily like political views, or they can be political, but when they do their scientific research, they're trying not to let that interfere. They're just reporting numbers. And the same is true of English writers, believe it or not, or scholars or whatever, working in humanities. Sometimes it's not, the take on it is not really important. You want to look at things objectively. So to avoid the bias that we often find on the internet, we go to scholarly sources. Scholarly sources and peer-reviewed sources are also better because, especially for your research essay, if you go on MVCC databases, which is where you will go, so if you click again on MVCC, you go to the libraries, and you go to online database, you can look individually through different databases that stores these articles, or you can look at all of the sources. So if, say, you put in Bartleby, but you don't care what kind of source it is, you might get thousands and thousands of hits. You might get books and videos and documentaries and articles, but you might want to limit your search to only online database. And if you do that, then you will just get articles, which I think is more manageable to work with when you are writing an essay like this. You are free to use books, you're free to use films, you're free to use documentaries, you're free to do interviews. Pretty much all of these will count as sources, but 4 of them have to be scholarly sources. So 4 of them have to be some kind of peer-reviewed source, an article. I typically recommend, students will ask me, well, what are some of the databases that you like to use? And I'm right here, I'm looking at the library, MECC libraries. It looks like this. Okay, I hope you can see it. It looks like this. But basically, I go into databases, and for something like what I'm asking you to do, there's a couple of databases that will be helpful to you. You can look at Academic OneFile, Academic Search Complete. You can look at Humanity Source. You can look at Literature Criticism Online. So, and literary sources. So literary sources, Literature Criticism Online, what did I say? Academic Search Premier, Academic OneFile, Humanity Source. So these are different databases that are going to help. So, and if you go into databases, you can look for under alphabetically, right? But if you don't want to do that, you can just put in the main sort of field. This is what I'm trying to. If you go on the library website and you see this one like search box right there, you can, if you just put in, say, Bartleby, it's going to pull all of the sources from everything that we have that mentions Bartleby, and you will get 1,630 sources. So it's an easier way to do it. And then you can also, on the side, you can say, I want something that's in full text. You know, I just want academic journals, and that's going to limit it to 421. You might say, well, you know, I want it to particular subject, like it has to do with Bartleby the Scrivener. There's criticism, there's literature, so there are ways to narrow them down for yourself. But once you start using MECC database, once you get used to it, it's really cool because you have such great knowledge at your fingertips. And it's better than Google. It just is. I mean, Google is easy, but Google takes you to places like Shmoop and SparkNotes, and I don't want you to use that for your research essay. Shmoop and SparkNotes and Wikipedia and you know, Bartleby.com, all of these websites, they're websites and they can be very helpful to you, but they're not scholarly. And I don't want you to get used to kind of using it as a crutch. Go to some of the people that know what they're talking about. You might find interesting things. Yes, it might be slightly harder to read, but at least you won't be, your sources will not be questioned. You know, the authenticity of your sources, which is extremely important in research essays. So I've been mentioning research essays, but I don't know if any of you have ever written one before. And research essay is typically a longer paper, and the huge component of it is the research part, right? You wrote, so far you wrote one essay for our class, and that class was not research paper. That essay was not a research essay. So I just asked you to analyze something about a story, right? I gave you specific topics. Research is a little bit different. You are kind of analyzing and arguing and informing and describing and defining all at the same time, you know. So it's kind of a combination of all of the techniques you have learned so far, I hope. But like I said, the huge component of research paper is the research, MLA, and of course the thesis writing. But we'll get to that in a second. So what are your topics? Again, if you're looking at your sheet, my topics, the topic says this, and I say topics, in parentheses, choose one. Please read carefully. Choose only one of these, right? So research the influence of Industrial Revolution or psychology or existentialism on one of the following, either Albert Camus the Stranger or Melville Bartleby the Scrivener or Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. Let me emphasize that because I don't want any confusion. Right, so what I'm asking you to do is pretty much what we've been talking about so far in the class, and I don't know if you noticed that there was a kind of a running theme in my class so far, at least in fiction, right? So we read some, I think, really interesting stories, and almost every single one has kind of a unique individualistic character. My interest, as I also mentioned in class, is that I'm really interested in the kind of early 20th century literature, specifically at the beginning of this modern age, and the artist and writer's preoccupation with modernity and progress, and the kind of influence that that might have on the individual and individual state, kind of surrounded in this ever-growing global society. So, you know, we see this in Gregor, we see this in Bartleby, and we'll certainly see the same in Meursault. All of this is connected, of course, with the industrialization, which is what we talked about. We talked about industrialization and capitalism and labor and workforce and what happens to people in societies like ours when you no longer can produce and work, or when you don't really feel like what you're being asked to do is good for you, but you feel compelled to do it, right? So there's that part, right? The other part is, I asked you, or psychology. Right? So we also talked about influence of psychology. So you might be interested to research the way in which Freudian psychology or the emergence of Freud's theory or Jungian theory influence some of the writers. You know, so you know how the Bartleby's characterization, you know, or Meursault's characterization, or Gregor's characterization. In what way is the psychology? You know, so you might want to look at particular theory by Freud. You know, you might look at his, I don't know, you know, theory of id-ego and superego, and see if it applies to Bartleby, you know, and see if it applies to, you know, Gregor. Or maybe I'm using Freudian theory, Jungian theory, or whatever, but maybe you're interested in like Maslow's theory of needs. You know, maybe you see that can be applied to some of these works. So you can do that. If you're interested in psychology, this would be a good opportunity to research that. So if you're interested in like economics, social issues, politics, I would say choose industrialization, because that's going to give you a lot to write about. If you're interested in more of a social science, maybe sociology or psychology, the way individuals and groups interact, I would choose the second one, so psychology. If you're interested in philosophy and its connection to modern age, I would choose existentialism. So that could easily be applied to every single story we read, but specifically that works best with The Stranger. Absurdism and existentialism together. So you pick one of those big topics, right? Industrialization or psychology or existentialism, and apply them to one of the works that I mentioned. So not all of them. You're either applying them to just the Metamorphosis, to just Bartleby, or to just The Stranger. So what is this supposed to look like? So again, every paper needs an introduction, and every paper needs title. You're going to begin with an interesting title. For your research essay, make sure that you have a cover page. So make sure that on your cover page you have, you know, the title in the middle, you know, your name, the class, you know, that's all centered in the middle. You've done the title pages before. And then your first paragraph should start on the top of the next page. The title page and the works cited page do not count as the number of pages, all right? What we mean by 6 to 8 pages is we're talking 6 to 8 pages of text, okay? So think of an interesting title. You actually did a really good job in your essays, and I was very proud of you. You listened, and I could tell because your titles were interesting, you know, and I could see that you were really trying to make the title work. So do exactly the same. Do exactly the same for your research essay. And you don't have to work on a title right now. Go back to it once everything is done. Think of the title last. You'll have more information about your essay, and you'll feel more comfortable giving it a title. So in the introduction, again, you want to provide basic information for your topic, and then at the end of your intro, you want to take on a particular stance and end it with a thesis. Okay. Again, a thesis is your statement of purpose, and it really, just like what we talked about with your first essay, it's not going to be any different. It's going to have a claim and reasons. Okay. It can be analytical or argumentative. Typically, it's some kind of combination of both. So you want to take a stand on whatever it is that you're researching. So for example, and I gave you a very specific example here, Gregor's physical transformation in Kafka's The Metamorphosis could symbolize his emotional and psychological feelings of insecurity and worthlessness in a modern capitalist society. And I put, if you make a claim such as this one, you have to support the underlined part with the evidence from the text. So I underlined emotional and psychological feelings of insecurity and worthlessness in modern capitalist society. So that's the part, your reasons are the parts that you have to support with scholarly sources. Okay. The scholarly sources should provide information, interpretation of the story, but also additional information on capitalism and its effect on the individual. So you're not only using your sources to provide some kind of background, excuse me, for, your topic. In other words, like if you're writing about capitalism, you want to talk about the emergence of capitalism. You want to talk about, some of its major components. You're not only using it for that, you are also using it to support your argument. So you want to choose wisely. Don't pick quotes just to pick a quote. Pick a quote that actually helps your point. How do you convince me that what you are saying is correct? You want to choose really strong quotes for that. So I put here, what kind of thesis are we looking for? You need to have a thesis that's well developed and clearly focused, that takes some kind of stand, that invites discussion, that it expresses one main idea, that's specific but not vague or too general, that's objective, logical, and debatable. And that's a lot of parts. But that's like in the perfect world, if you were writing a perfect thesis, you would have to hit all of these points. And like I said, for the most part in your essays you did. So all you have to do is duplicate that. Duplicate it for your research essay. The body of your research essay is where you present the information. So do not quote anything in the introduction. Don't quote anything in the conclusion. Quote in the body, all right? It can be broken into any number of paragraphs that you need. Each paragraph should contain one main idea. Start the paragraph with a topic sentence, right? Or as a claim that states your purpose for that paragraph, and then support the same with evidence. Again, the same thing that I asked you to do for the first essay. Everything you use from other source, so either it's direct quote, paraphrase, a summary, you have got to tell me where you got that source, okay? You have to cite absolutely everything to avoid plagiarizing. And this is where I include, if you open this online, this is where I include the link to the library MLA 8th edition. So you also need to not only use it in text, you have to use it in the works cited page. There have to be, corresponding entry in the works cited page. I said here that you can use a combination of direct quotes, paraphrases, and block quotations. So you can use short quotes, sometimes just plugging or taking out the words or the phrases that are useful to you. You don't even have to use complete sentences. You can use paraphrase, in other words, you can put it in your own words. If you decide to quote something that's over 4 lines, you have to use a block quote. And on your research essay assignment, I actually show you what that looks like. You have to indent the quote in the middle so that's offset. If it's more than 4 lines, don't use too many of block quotes, okay? There are not a lot of quotes out there that you need to use in its entirety, in like 5, 6, or 7 lines, just to fill out the paper. Don't do that, okay? 1 or 2 is sufficient if you really need to do it. Otherwise, stick to shorter quotes. And I put here a general rule of thumb is don't use more of a quote than your own work. So if I go through your research paper and I see that you have more quotes than your actual words, that's not going to work. I have to grade you on your work alone. Quotes are there to support your work, not replace it. I put that in bold, okay? So it's just for support. It's not meant to replace it. So I give you some example how to write a paragraph, right? So signal phrase, introduce quote, then include the quote, and then explain the quote. And I gave you an example, 2 examples of using same idea, same quotes, but in one I use actual 4 lines, and in another I just extract phrases about Gregor that I want to apply in the quote. So take a look at that. So it's example 1 and example 2. And I think you're going to find that helpful, or I hope you're going to find it helpful. And finally, there's a conclusion. And again, in the research essay, it should not be 2 sentences long. I know you spent a long time writing, and then when we get to the conclusion, we're tired. We think like it doesn't really matter. maybe that's true. You know, I don't know. I mean, to me, it's true. Conclusion is not the most important part of the essay. But it is important because it's supposed to tie everything up together. You know, it's kind of like providing an ongoing discussion at the end. You know, what did you want to provide an overview? What was your topic? What was your statement of, you know, what was your purpose for writing it? What were some interesting things that you found? What did the overall research prove or show? And you might want to leave the reader with some kind of question or discussion or something else that needs additional research. You want to leave the reader thinking about your work specifically, okay? Don't introduce new ideas, new points, or new quotes in your conclusion. All of that needs to be in the body, okay? Conclusion is just to conclude. And I give you some examples here on the audience and tone. So you have to sort of take on a tone of, like you have to imagine that you're trying to publish this in some kind of serious publication, such as scholarly journal or anthology of essays. And you have to like try to avoid inserting things of values and morals in your arguments, right? Things that we cannot really prove. You want to avoid personal opinions and emotions, right? So in other words, just saying things the way you feel about them without researching them, okay? So all of it is going to be your opinion, but it's going to be based on the research, and once you state your opinion, the expectation is that you will support it with that research. You want to avoid adjectives like good, great, bad, you know, and slang words. Sarcasm and irony that don't translate well in essays. You don't want to present a one-sided research, so you always want to make sure that you have a well-balanced research essay. It's got to be free of grammatical and spelling errors, and it has to be proofread, edited, and revised. Okay, so that's pretty much what I included here. So take a look at this handout assignment. Think about what you might want to do. If you, between now and Monday, think of something and you need to ask me a question, feel free to email me. As I mentioned before, I'll have access to my laptop. Otherwise, if it's not an emergency or if it's not something you think you need to know right away, jot it down on your paper or in your notebook, and when we come back Monday, we can go over some of your questions. And I hope that you found this helpful. Thank you, and I will see you Monday.